Well, thank you very much indeed for reading. Please do keep that passage open. We're going to be looking at that together. We're at 46 and 47 in Genesis, and we're about halfway through, just over halfway through our series towards the end of the book of Genesis in Joseph. God meant it for good. You may find the points on the inside notice sheet on the reverse useful as we guide you through our time together. In the mid-1800s, a man by the name of David Livingston boarded a boat and set sail for Africa. He was an intrepid explorer, a philanthropist, most of all, according to a few biographies that I've been looking at, a missionary. He lived for 60 years. 30 of those he spent in Africa. Had a number of things that were going on in his mind at that time. It was an unexplored continent. He wanted to find the source of the Nile. He wanted to ascend the Zambezi, whatever that means, and he wanted to explore right at the heart of Africa. He loved the people of Africa, and he desperately wanted to share the gospel with him. One writer puts it like this: he traveled through the heart of this unknown continent, and wherever he went, he left a trail of light. He died in Africa, and his servants that he was with, who had apparently all been converted, removed his heart and buried it very close to a tree where he had died, inscribed his name on the tree. They insisted on carrying his body back to the British consul. Eventually, it was shipped to London, and it's buried in Westminster Abbey. You can go and see it, or at least the grave. Now, whilst his body was returned to the country of his birth, his heart was placed in the country that he loved. In our passage today, we see God's people settle their lives and families in Egypt, but their hopes, their hearts, we could say, were not for Egypt. They were always for the promised land. Let me ask you today, where is your heart? You see, the God of Genesis offers something better than this world, better than even the best of this world. He always promised, right from the start of Genesis, when he started speaking, he always promised to take his people to the promised land. And because God is sovereign, his people can be absolutely sure he will do it. That's the main point that we're going to see today. God is sovereign, and he will certainly bring his people home. And so the big application that we'll end up with today: will we be people who live in light of this? Where is your heart? We've just been singing, haven't we? Take my heart, oh, take and seal it from your courts above. Where is your heart as you find yourself here today? Through the book of Genesis, we've seen God at work, establishing a people for himself, saving them, protecting them, promising to bless them in the end. We come to the first point on the handout there: a sovereign God. A sovereign God. Joseph is the Lord's man, and it is through Joseph, we've said this all through the series, it's through Joseph that we see God at work. We've seen lots of details. You remember we started the Joseph series by seeing the dreams that he had, and we pointed out the interpretation of these dreams. Only if you're from God can you interpret the dreams. The Lord was working through him sovereignly. Joseph was brought from the dungeon to the palace, from rags to riches, to save his people. He was a slave, and he was made a prince, and for one purpose: to save God's people, to bring them to safety. The Lord is sovereignly at work. And now in the text today, we get a clear emphasis again on God working through Joseph. Look at what he does for his people. Look at 47 verse 1. Joseph settles his family into new homes. Joseph went in and told Pharaoh, "My father, my brothers, with their flocks and herds and all that they possess, have come from the land of Canaan. They are now in the land of Goshen." You see, it wasn't just survival. I mean, Goshen was posh. We made a point of that last week. These were the plush houses. These were the capability brown design gardens. This was the best of the land. And lots of fields for their flocks and herds, lots more than you could shake a shepherd's crook at. Pure luxury underlines God's generosity. Now, this isn't the promised land, but what a contrast to what they had. You remember, we've been referring to it as the certain death, so-called promised land, that they've been brought out of and into Egypt. You see, God sovereignly at work through Joseph. And Joseph didn't just get his family into good places to live. Look, he secured jobs for his brothers, top jobs. Look at 47 verse 5. Pharaoh said to Joseph, your father and your brothers have come to you. The land of Egypt is before you. Settle your father and your brothers in the best of the land. Let them settle in the land of Goshen. And if you know any able men among them, put them in charge of my livestock. Jobs for the boys. Everything sorted. The world faces economic meltdown, and God sovereignly uses Joseph to set the family up. And then Joseph organizes an audience for his father, Jacob, with Pharaoh. This is a really curious bit. I don't know what you made of this as you heard it read. I mean, Pharaoh, you've got to understand, Pharaoh is the most powerful man in the world at this stage. He's the ultimate controller of food and of life. And then look at verse 7. Joseph brought in Jacob, his father, stood him before Pharaoh. Now, this is quite an impressive feat. I mean, we're told in the next verse that he's 130 years old. And you get this idea of him being sort of stood in front of Pharaoh, like he needed to sort of be propped up and sort of put against a Zimmer frame or something. What would you expect to happen? You've got this old man standing in the Zimmer frame. He's been sort of pulled out of his mobility scooter. You've got Pharaoh, the most impressive, the most powerful man in the world. What would you expect to happen? Well, you'd expect this man who's just received the generosity of the most powerful man in the world, the incredible gift of land. You'd expect him to bow the knee, wouldn't you? But look what happens, verse 7. Jacob blesses Pharaoh. Same in verse 10. Jacob blesses Pharaoh. As one of the commentators points out, we see here the greater blessing the lesser. And I think what we're getting here is a glimpse of the way things should be. The ancient patriarch, respectful, but knows his allegiance ultimately is owed to God alone. No knee is bowed at this audience. You see, God alone is sovereign. And through Jacob, his blessing flows to the nations represented by Pharaoh. And who controls it all? Joseph orchestrates everything. He brings in his father to bless Pharaoh and make it all possible. He's the one calling the shots. The narrator really underlines this. Look how this sort of section closes. Verse 11. Joseph settled his father and his brothers and gave them possession in the land of Egypt, in the best of the land, in the land of Ramesses, as Pharaoh had commanded. I love that little detail at the end, as Pharaoh had commanded. We're sort of thinking, having just followed through all those details, Pharaoh had commanded. But it was Joseph's idea in the first place, and Joseph is the one that orchestrated the whole thing. And he managed to make it look like Pharaoh had put the commands in place. This is God's man carrying out God's sovereign plans. And God uses Joseph to provide everything the people could need, everything they could want, and so much more. And at the same time, God uses Joseph to not just build his people into this perfect place, but also to slowly deprive the people of Egypt of everything they own. There's a point of transition at verse 12 and 13. It's like a sort of hinge through everything we've just heard read. Verse 12 sort of sums up what Joseph has done for his people. And then from verse 13 onwards to 26, we see Joseph gradually buying the land and everything in it, even the people, and giving it all to Pharaoh. We see this sort of played out in 3 encounters between the people and Joseph. They come to him, you see, because they need food. First, they spend their money. When they have no money left, they need more food, so they come to Joseph. They spend their livestock. They give all their livestock to Joseph. And when that's all gone, they sell their properties, and then finally they sell themselves into slavery. Look at verse 20, we get the summary. Joseph bought all the land of Egypt for Pharaoh, for all the Egyptians sold their fields because the famine was severe on them. The land became Pharaoh's. As for the people, he made servants of them from one end of Egypt to the other. Look at verse 23. Joseph said to the people, behold, I have this day bought you and your land for Pharaoh. You can almost imagine, can't you, as that last transaction took place, Joseph announces, that's it. I've got it all. Lock, stock, and barrel. All of Egypt. It belongs to me. What an amazing reversal of fortunes. This is the one that had been enslaved by the Egyptians, now enslaves the whole of Egypt. One day, we know as we read through the Bible, that would be reversed, but for now, everything is just as it should be. Joseph has orchestrated a new world order. God's people, on the one hand, living in bliss, free, daily bread, comfort. The Egyptian people, on the other hand, well, they've lost everything. They're in servitude. Yeah, they have life, but it's come at great cost, hasn't it? And they've given everything. And what do they have to show for it? Nothing but the next breath that they breathe. So God is in control. He blesses his people. He takes everything from the Egyptians, and Joseph does it all. But the question we should be asking is, why are we being shown this? Okay, God is sovereign. We can see the people are blessed, and everyone in Egypt is in pretty dire straits at the moment. But why? What is the point of this? Well, that brings us to the second subpoint there, to show that God keeps his promises. I think the interpretive key comes in verse 27. Have a look at it. Thus Israel settled in the land of Egypt, in the land of Goshen, and they gained possessions in it, and they were fruitful, and they multiplied greatly. That last phrase, just look at it again. They were fruitful, and they multiplied greatly. That should bring us back to reality with a bump. This is the language of God's promises. This is language, if we've been reading through Genesis, we're thinking, this is familiar. This is what I've been looking out for. This is what God's people keep on getting promised. And this is why everything has been ordered the way it has been, to make the conditions just right for God's people to multiply and be fruitful. Baby making becomes the primary occupation of God's people. And they were good at it. They were really good at it. Over the generations that followed, now that the conditions were just right, the baby started exploding. The population went crazy. 600,000 men, women, and children. That's probably about 2.5 million people after 400 years. Now, that's an incredible turnaround, isn't it? But I think we're meant to go a little bit further than that. So, okay, the conditions have been made right and God's people multiply. But it leaves a question. Yes, people, but we're reminded of these promises, and all through the book of Genesis, the promises told us about land. And here they are in Egypt. And verse 27, look at verse 27 again. It sort of rubs home this point. Thus Israel settled in the land of Egypt, in the land of Goshen. You're sort of thinking, Egypt, Goshen, that's not the promised land. That's not Canaan. I think it's to do exactly that. It's to rub home the point that they're not in the place they should be. We're meant to ask, well, what about the promised land? Now, at this stage, it's not unhelpful to look at a map. I'm afraid I don't have a map. You'll have to picture one in your head. If you looked at a map of Egypt, you would see the land of Goshen. It's a big region. It had to be pretty big because about 2.5 million Israelites were one day going to live there. It was a big region. If you look at Egypt, you'll see Goshen on the eastern flank of the land. Now, that's a pretty dull geographic observation in the life of Jacob. But 400 years later, in the life of Moses, this gave the people of Israel a massive advantage when it came to breaking out of the land. You see, to be in the land of Goshen is not just posh. Posh was irrelevant at that stage. It was strategic. It was close to the Nile Delta. It was close to the border. Yes, in Egypt, but perfectly situated to escape. One day, you see, it would be time to leave. And if you lived in Goshen, you were already on the way to the promised land. And the interesting thing is, at this stage in the narrative, both Israel, that's Jacob, and his sons seem to grasp this. So God is in control through his man Joseph, keeping his promises. And amazingly, we start to see God's people actually living in light of this. We see this in a number of places. Look back at verse 2. As the brothers stand before Pharaoh, and from among his brothers he took 5 men, presented them to Pharaoh, and Pharaoh said to his brothers, "What is your occupation?" And they said to Pharaoh, "Your servants are shepherds, as our fathers were." And they said to Pharaoh, "We have come to sojourn in the land." Now this word sojourn, it means essentially to only stay somewhere temporarily, to be a guest, a temporary resident, an expat, if you like. It's somebody who is not a citizen. So as the brothers stood before Pharaoh, it's like they were saying, look, we're shepherds. We're desperate, yeah, we need pasture for our flocks, we need to provide for our families, but please understand, we're not here to stay. Please understand, Pharaoh, we're just passing through. We're sojourners. Jacob too, as he stands before Pharaoh, look at this, 47 verse 8. Okay, we get those two blessings that Jacob gives to Pharaoh, and then in between, look what he says to Pharaoh. Pharaoh said to Jacob, how many are the days of your life? And then Jacob said to Pharaoh, the days of my years of my sojourning are 130. Now that's quite interesting because you see Jacob describes not just his arrival in the land of Egypt as a temporary stay, but all of his life as a temporary stay. And if you think of his life, he spent a good portion of his life living in the land of Canaan. And yet he still described that as being a temporary residence. Even when Jacob was in the promised land, he described himself as sojourning. We go even further. Look at what he says next to Pharaoh in the middle of verse 9. Few and evil have been the days of the years of my life, and they have not attained to the days of the years of the life of my fathers, in the days of their sojourning. It's like he's saying, look, by the way, Pharaoh, my fathers, Isaac and Abraham, yeah, they lived much longer than me, actually. I think they lived 175, 180 years respectively, so they had slightly longer years. But they had the same attitude too. They were simply sojourning too. They were temporary residents. And we know that they spent a long time in the promised land, but they always knew that they were going somewhere better. Many years after David Livingston left Africa, many other missionaries followed in his footsteps. One such couple arrived about 50 years after him, so sort of early 1900s. They spent most of their working life explaining the gospel to communities in Central Africa, which was, relatively speaking, much more opened up by then. And one day they decided it was time to return home and hand the work on to other missionaries. They boarded a ship bound for the States. They were from New York, and they returned to New York, having not been there for 40 years. When finally, after weeks at sea, it was time for the boat to dock, the gangway was lowered, and the two missionaries, this missionary couple, noticed a big crowd of people that were waiting to greet them. There was a band playing, and they were throwing sort of streamers around and waving flags. And the missionaries looked at each other, stunned that their church had gone to so much trouble to welcome them home. But the excitement was short-lived. They soon realized that the band and the celebrations, they weren't for them. They were for some dignitary returning on the same ship from a successful hunting trip. As they got off their ship, they realized that actually nobody from their church had come at all. No one was there to welcome them. No one seemed to care, at which point the wife grabbed the hand of the husband, squeezed it, and simply said, "We're not home yet." See, this is the view of God's people in Egypt. Not home yet, just passing through, temporary residence. That's exactly why the section ends as it does. You get this rather curious detail. Jacob making Joseph promise to take his body out of Egypt. Just look at it, 47 verse 29. You've got this rather odd ritual going on at the same time. Verse 29, when the time drew near that Israel must die, he called his son Joseph and said to him, "If now I have found favor in your sight, put your hands under my thigh and promise to deal kindly and truly with me. Do not bury me in Egypt. Let me lie with my fathers. Carry me out of Egypt." You see, the dying patriarch has a correct perspective on this world. Egypt is not his home. I'm just here temporarily. God has in store for me another land. And the carrying out of Jacob's body, which was to happen a few years later, it was a wonderful visual aid, wasn't it, for all around. Israel does not live in Egypt. It belongs in God's country. Now, there's an alternative worldview that runs through all of this. And I think this really brings home the important point for us. It's shown by the Egyptians. You see, they weren't sojourners. The Egyptians were residents, not passing through, but they've carved out a life for themselves. And I think the text is structured to really bring this to our attention. The futility of their existence. You see, if God's people lived in light of the promise as well, the Egyptians lived, and that's all. They just lived. Have a look at verse 15. When the money was all spent in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan, all the Egyptians came to Joseph and said, "Give us food. Why should we die before your eyes?" Look down to verse 19, you get it twice. Why should we die? End of the verse. Give us seed that we may live and not die. And they achieve their dream. That's their dream, just not to die. Verse 25, they speak to Joseph, "You have saved our lives." But what sort of life have they got? What sort of life have they carved out? Everything sold, even their bodies into slavery. It's a rather sort of eerie picture of people living outside the hope and certainty of God's promises. You see, to be outside of God's promises, there's nothing more than just the meaningless pursuit of just carving out life. Now, through all this, again, we see a few people that are protected from the meaningless pursuit of just living. There are two groups of people in the text. There's Jacob and his family, and there's also the priests of Egypt. Why were they both protected? They seem to have this special existence. They're the ones that don't end up in servitude. Jacob and his family, and the priests of Egypt. Well, both of them have a relationship with Joseph, of course. You see, Joseph is related to one lot by blood and the other lot by marriage. If you remember a few chapters back, we heard that little detail, that Joseph was married to one of the priests. You see, it's a relationship to Joseph that makes all the difference. And as we said through this series, I mean, Joseph is God's man in Egypt. He is the picture of Jesus Christ. It was wonderful hearing earlier on, wasn't it, as Cara, just before she was baptized, as she shared her testimony, something that she had been gripped by as she got to know the person of Jesus Christ. I love the way she explained how her life was deeply unsatisfying. I made a few notes as she was writing, as she was explaining these things, how she Googled and found St. Helen's and found the church family here, and over a year got to know Jesus. She said, surprised by the extraordinary, perfect, faultless life of Jesus, he stands back as just being very, very different to anyone in this world, doesn't he? And then she described the new life that she found because of him, hope and certainty and assurance. Can I just say, if you're visiting here today, please ask somebody about this new life that is available through Jesus Christ. You can ask anyone here would love to tell you more about the new life available through Jesus Christ. As we stand back and look at this big picture in Genesis, we see a God who is in control through Joseph, and he organizes all the people in the known world in line with his promises. God's people, a picture of freedom, liberty. Everyone else, a picture of servitude. And so two worldviews flow. God's people then, eyes on another country, confidence in what God has promised, certainty that God would definitely take them to that country. We could call it living in light of the promised land. Everyone else, everyone not related to Joseph, outside of God's promises. I thought Cara again explained that beautifully. Owned by a desire to win her boss's approval. The people then, they were owned by Pharaoh, scrabbling around for the next meal. We could call it living, sure, but you can't call it much more. And so as we come to application, well, the particular challenge, I hope, is really obvious. I mean, if you're here and you're not in a right relationship with God, visiting, maybe you've been coming for some time now, and you're thinking, actually, I don't have this right relationship with God, then look at this God who makes promises, who offers hope, who offers not just liberty now, but hope and certainty for the future through Jesus Christ. The futility of life outside God's promises, the picture in the text is really ugly. It's meant to be. It's meant to make us say, that is a really unattractive life. It's hopeless. It's futile. Again, don't leave here without asking more, please. But for many of us who are in a right relationship with God, well, back to the challenge that we started with. Where is your heart? God's people then knew that they were heading to the promised land. There have been all sorts of ups and downs as we've been going through the Joseph narrative. But they seemed to grasp by this stage that they were heading to the promised land, this world that they're just passing through, not home yet. The brothers in Genesis, well, they landed, I guess what we must presume was the best job in the world as Joseph set up with Pharaoh. The possibility of the brothers looking after Pharaoh's livestock. I mean, this was the sort of the platinum-plated job of the day. First-class travel, all the perks. And their words as they spoke to Pharaoh were just here to sojourn, Pharaoh. We're just passing through. I've got a good friend who I know. He goes to another church, but I know him through one of the midweek ministries that I'm involved in. He's a mature Christian, much more mature than me in all sorts of ways. A few years back, he'd spent 15 years at a bank, and he was promoted to an impressive sounding title, the Global Head of Communications or something like that. And after a month in this new job, which was a few years ago now, he realized he'd made a mistake because his attendance at church was being challenged. His leadership of a group that he was involved in with another group of Christians had to stop. And he said most significantly that his ability to share the gospel, to share the good news that we're hearing about through all of this with his colleagues, it diminished massively. After a month, he asked for a demotion. And his boss thought he was mad. 5 months later, he finally got the demotion and went back to his old job. He said it was a wonderful relief because he was able to get properly involved with the things that mattered. Just passing through, sojourning. Jacob, he's settled in a palace, isn't he? Everything that you could dream of. I mean, forget winning the lottery. Jacob, rich beyond all means. And as he stood before Pharaoh, what did he say? Just passing through. Actually, my whole life, just like the life of my fathers, just passing through. Turn to Hebrews just as we close. It's worth seeing this attitude. It's summed up so beautiful. Page 1212. The writer in Hebrews gives a long list of names, lots of Bible heroes, including the patriarchs of Genesis, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Now look at the end of Hebrews chapter 11, verse 39. And all these, though commended through their faith, did not receive what was promised, since God had provided something better for us, that apart from us, they should not be made perfect. You see, God will certainly bring his new creation. God will certainly bring his people to a better country. He will certainly do it because he is sovereign. We're just challenged to live in light of this. I've got some Christian friends from, again, a different church, and they came to the conclusion that if they were going to put this into practice, that the best thing for them to do was to not own the house that they lived in. And I said, well, why? Surely, I mean, you could afford to buy a house. You're in a situation at your stage in life where you could. And they said, yes, but renting a house helps us to remember that we're not here to stay. HSBC have a big poster campaign at the moment, you may have seen it, trying to get people to take out a mortgage with them. Just simply says, one day, not someday. In other words, come and take out a mortgage with us, and your dream of owning a property can be made true with HSBC. There's a picture of a first-time home buyer throwing a housewarming party. Now, of course, it's not wrong to own. But if you're just about to hold a housewarming party, tell one another during the party, this isn't your home. It's just a house. It'll be yours for a few years, then it will belong to somebody else. You're just passing through. You're not home yet, Christian. Where is your heart? A sovereign God will bring his people home. We should live in light of that. Let me close in prayer. Praise you, Heavenly Father, that you are in control of this world. We thank you for the Lord Jesus. And we pray, Heavenly Father, that we will be people who respond rightly to the Lord Jesus and who live in light of your certain promises. May we be people who realize that we're not home yet.